We are about a month into Belal Muhammad's dominant reign as the new UFC Welterweight Champion. And here's what I want to see next for him. So immediately after the fight, in the post-fight press conference, Dana was asked what's next for him. They asked him if they were planning a rematch with Leon, and he said no. He very confidently said, no, we got something else planned for him. And what did we all think? We all thought that this was Shavkat Rakhmonov. I do think Shavkat is next. I just think the way that Dana was talking at the post-fight presser, the way that Belal and Shavkat have kind of been tweeting at each other, it just seems like that's what's next. JDM is hurt, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. One thing about Belal, he has been crushing it with his Twitter fingers this last month. The guy's gotten more hate than you can possibly imagine the last couple years leading up to this fight, and then after winning the belt, he was still getting ripped apart. Even though he dominated Leon Edwards, I don't think he should be getting much hate. A fight that we all saw coming, right? Well, at least one of us did. So I got Belal Muhammad. Remember the name by decision. You don't get to 480 subscribers on the tube without making a few enemies and a couple of bold predictions. We've seen this guy go at Shavkat, but we've also seen him and Usman exchange words on Twitter. Kamaru Usman, a guy who's lost 3 fights in a row. Obviously, he was a dominant champion. In my book, he's a top 10 fighter in the history of the UFC. But does this guy deserve a title shot after losing 3 fights in a row? I think that would be very dumb of the UFC to do right now. But when we look at Shavkat Rakhmonov, we saw Khabib and Islam grow up wrestling bears. This guy looks like he grew up wrestling woolly mammoths and doing who knows what. So watching his come up was very, very cool. Seeing, he finishes every fight. We know the stats. I think it's pretty much an even amount of submission. I think he's 18-0, 10 subs, 8 KOs. Unfathomable numbers like that. Who does that? But there's always a but. His aura has almost made him a little bit overrated at this point. He has 2 real wins against Jeff Neal, who gave him all he could handle, who cracked him multiple times on the feet. I always like to see a prospect go into a war like that. Same with Hamzat and Burns. It's one thing to just, kind of buzzsaw your way through everyone, but it is good to see you get rocked. It's good to see you in a war and come out the other side. So I think the Jeff Neal fight was good for him. Who does he fight next? 60-year-old Wonder Boy, and he just subs him. He doesn't mess around on the feet. You sub Wonder Boy. When was that fight? It was this past December. The guy's inactivity has been a little bit ridiculous. So if we're being honest, again, I think that's the fight they're going to make. I think Jack Della Maddalena is a more deserving contender. They're both undefeated in the UFC. They've kind of come up the same way. So what's the difference between them? The difference is who has the best win, who has the bigger win. And it's not even close. Jack Della violently knocked out Gilbert Burns, who's been in the welterweight title picture for, almost 5 years now. And Shavkat submitted Wonder Boy. Those wins are not created equal. Della has a much better win. Now, is it that cut and dry? Absolutely not. Jack Della had had arm surgery after that fight. I know he really wanted to make his return at UFC 305 in Perth last week, but he kept kind of delaying his return, and he announced about 6 weeks before that fight. He said, "I'm still not ready," and he said he wants to fight before the end of the year. So I do kind of think him and Belal's timeline adds up. Belal just fought. What was that, the last weekend in July, first week in August, something like that. So while I do think that they are going to give him Shavkat, truthfully, I just think Jack Della is a more deserving contender. And while I don't think Usman deserves a title shot, the only reason why I would be okay with that is because I think the best fight you can make in the UFC right now is Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Jack Della Maddalena. I want to see that fight so badly. I think that's the dictionary definition of a number 1 contender fight. And the way these two have risen up the ranks around the same time has been very cool to see. Jack Della has maybe the best boxing in the sport, and Shavkat is just a world beater and finishes everyone, right? So That would be a super interesting fight. If Jack Della was healthy, I remember hearing rumors that they were trying to make that fight for UFC 305, and obviously it didn't end up working out. But man, that would be the perfect number one contender fight. So I guess you got to give Shavkat the title shot. But again, it's kind of strange to me. They're both undefeated. The only thing that I think separates them is that Della has a bigger win, but it seems like they're going with Shavkat, and I think that's a great fight. And what I will tell you right here, in August, I will make my prediction that I do think Belal Muhammad beats Shavkat Rakhmonov, obviously by decision. That probably went without saying, but again, I don't think Shavkat is overrated by any stretch. But y'all better stop sleeping on Belal Muhammad. Y'all better remember the name. That's all I'm saying, man. I think stylistically, he matches up pretty decent with Shavkat. And all these people, right? These haters, after Belal won the belt, everyone was saying, yeah, like, okay, get ready for Shavkat, buddy. It's like, dude, like if you don't respect Belal after the Leon Edwards fight, I get being a Belal hater, dude. I'm a certified hater myself, and I've been ripping Belal for years. I get it. I'm just saying it's funny to see people, be seriously hate this guy and like not think he's championship material when he just threw Leon Edwards around for 25 minutes and he outstruck him. I think Shavkat, I mean, there's levels in this game. Shavkat's striking, his kicks, I think they could give real problems to Belal, but I still think Belal is going to get that one done. But what some other fights to see in this welterweight division, in this title picture? Who's the name I didn't mention? Obviously, he who must not be named, the cuck himself, Ian Gary, another undefeated contender in this 170-pound division. What's next for him? Probably the easiest fight to make in this division. It's the former champ, Leon Edwards. He should be fighting Ian Gary. I know right after the fight, he was like, oh, we'll run it back, Belal. Obviously, he does not deserve a rematch, especially the way that fight went. Ian Gary, the two have history. When Leon was champ and Ian Gary was looking like he was a fight or two away from getting a title shot, there was a kind of a brewing rivalry between the two, right? They used to be sparring partners. They were in the same gym. And by all accounts, Ian Gary was kicked out of the gym. They had a little bit of a back and forth. Gary says that he used to touch him up in sparring, and Leon and the boys didn't like it. Leon obviously has a very different story. How do we find out which one is true? You throw him in the octagon, lock the door for 15 minutes, and we could figure it all out in there. I think that's a great fight. I think Ian Gary, he lost pretty much all his hype this last year, really, all leading up to his last fight versus MVP. Honestly, like nothing I've ever seen before in my time being a fan of the sport. I can't really, off the top of my head at least, think of something that compares to Ian Gary's fall off, at least, from the fans, I'm saying, not from his fights. The guy's undefeated as a professional mixed martial artist. He had the whole Irish Conor thing going for him. And by Conor thing, I mean literally quote for quote, just saying what Conor, just acting like Conor, cosplaying as Conor McGregor. That's what I mean by the whole Conor thing. But yeah, he was showing up. He was knocking people out. His striking looked next level. He was putting people away. And then, he gets matched up with MVP. And yeah, MVP outstruck him badly. And we saw him turn into a wrestler after a dominant round by MVP in the second. In the third round, we had Gary shooting for legs the whole time, kind of just laying and praying, and he won a very boring decision. He just got really outclassed on the feet. Even in a couple minutes into the third, he was still getting outclassed. He ends up getting a takedown and kind of just laying and praying his way to a victory in that one. I thought he definitely won, but, you don't get too excited about a striker having to resort to his wrestling in that way, especially in a division. It's not, I don't think his wrestling is what's going to win him these bigger fights. I think all the guys ranked ahead of him. I mean, we're looking at from the champion in Belal to the guy who I think he's going to fight, former champ Leon Edwards, to Kamaru Usman, to Shavkat Rakhmonov, even like a Colby, like all these guys, you're not going to be looking like a wrestler against them. So that's not really what you wanted to see from Ian Gary. Michael Venom Page just looked way faster. Again, I think his stock really went down in that fight. I think if he went out there and, if he got that first round submission, or if he put MVP's lights out, then you're seeing people say, why isn't this guy getting talked about for a title shot? So I think him versus Leon Edwards, we got to see Leon get back in there with a contender. And, there aren't too many names that he hasn't fought in that division. So I think that's the fight to make at welterweight. As for some of these other guys, I really don't know. Like I was just looking through all these names, trying to sort them all out. And I really have no idea. Like I thought Usman, he's even thrown the Wonder Boy name out there because that would be more of like a legacy fight. For whatever reason, they just booked Wonder Boy versus Joaquin Buckley, which is honestly makes me so mad. I'm working on a video right now, just all the dream matchups I want to see in the UFC. If everyone wanted Michael Venom Page versus Wonder Boy, but like I didn't really think that was the fight to make. MVP looked like, maybe he could make some noise in this welterweight division, compete for a belt. Clearly, he's not a championship level fighter in the UFC. So let's give him a fun fight. Let's give him Wonder Boy. The more big brain fans will know that that's probably going to turn out to be a boring fight, because anytime you throw two guys with those type of styles in there, it ends up being a leg kick off, and it ends up being boring. But I think that would be still be a more exciting fight than giving Wonder Boy to Joaquin Buckley. Like I'm not the biggest fan of Buckley, but yeah. So that takes all these like legacy fights off the table for Wonder Boy. Who should Kamaru Usman fight? I genuinely have no idea. Like he listed like 7 names, and he's like, all I'm gonna say is one of these guys is next. Like, yeah, thanks, buddy. You didn't really narrow it down there. But if Jack Della doesn't get the shot, I think you can't really say in a division that loaded that like he could just sit out and get a title shot. So I think we would see him in there with an Usman. Colby is kind of just stealing that number at this point. I don't think he's going to fight anyone. Ian Gary versus JDM is a very interesting fight to me. But I think those are more – I would rather see those two not fight each other. I'd rather see Ian Gary versus Leon Edwards, and I'd rather see JDM get in there with Kamaru Usman. I think those are more exciting fights in my eyes. Yeah, those are the fights I want to see. I think Belal will fight Shavkat next, although we're being robbed of the ultimate #1 contender fight with Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Jack Della Maddalena. So if JDM can't get in there for the belt or versus Shavkat, I'd like to see him versus Usman. And I think probably the most obvious fight to make out of all these is Leon Edwards versus Ian Gary.